DBT PE is a little different than standard DBT. Well, it's a lot different than standard DBT, but it's different in the sense that it is a protocol. Dr. Melanie Harned is one of the DBT luminaries. And so she started to look at it, but the interesting thing was that prolonged exposure, which is Edna Foa's creation, has some exclusionary criteria. She researched multiple trauma approaches and felt that prolonged exposure was the most potentially a good fit for DBT. And so it's not scripted exactly, but when you walk away from that training, you have all the steps you need to take, and you've done the practice, and you can immediately go back to your office and apply DBT PE. And obviously you'll get better at it the more you do it. So DBT PE, just to be clear, is PE adapted to the DBT population with a few modifications to make it appropriate for a DBT setting. So prolonged exposure is an exposure form of trauma therapy that is designed to help people process through traumatic events in their lives. It is especially helpful for like single event kinds of traumatic experiences where people use a combination of in vivo exposure, which is in real life, and imaginal exposure, which is where they talk through in a kind of structured, systematic way the traumatic experience that they had. The in vivo exposure is approaching, they develop a hierarchy of contexts in life that they've avoided related to the traumatic experience. And so then step by step, they work towards approaching those things that they have previously been avoiding to kind of retrain the brain to recognize that they are capable of approaching those things. One of the main components of trauma that kind of keeps it perpetuating and keeps it in that post-traumatic category is avoidance. Avoidance of the emotions associated with the trauma, avoidance of being emotionally overwhelmed, avoidance of memories or triggers. And so the exposure, that type of exposure, builds people's confidence in their ability to handle the emotions that might come up when they approach those things. You know, it's stage 2 work, which means you have to have already gone through the process. Other trauma modalities might call it resourcing. We would call it skill building, but it's that process of getting to a place where you have some ability to tolerate discomfort, to regulate your emotions, to self-soothe. So it's somebody who has done those things. And then really the main criteria that you need for any trauma approach is the trauma has become their primary target now. It has become the thing that is the most important for them to address. There aren't other sort of target behaviors or high-risk things that need to be stabilized first. And now they're saying, this is the most important thing to me, is to address this trauma now. And so then it becomes the most important target. But the process of going through PE, it takes a few weeks to kind of work through the materials that are getting ready, explaining how it works to clients, assessing their level of PTSD symptoms, talking through what the structure would look like, what they can expect. So maybe you'd be on like week 4-ish when you start to actually process the trauma. And then it takes as long as it takes. I mean, you know, ideally, if we're talking again about a single incident trauma, you would, if it's working, like if it's a fit for the person and they're really connecting with the process, you would expect the level of distress associated with that particular memory to come down fairly quickly, like within a few weeks. But it really depends on the person and what they're contending with. One of the things you do, that clients do through the process of DBT PE is they rate their SUDS. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of SUDS, but it's subjective units of distress. And they do that while they're talking through the trauma. But then they also have a sheet where they record their level of certain emotions. So it's, you know, sadness, anger, shame, there's a couple of other ones, but they rate this sort of before and after sessions, before and after doing homework. It's just part of the standard process, so you're tracking how their emotions are shifting. So what tends to happen when people first start to approach trauma sometimes after years and years of avoiding it and shutting down their emotions about it, is that anger shows up, right? They have maybe not allowed themselves to feel anger about what they experienced, or it hasn't felt safe to feel anger. So initially, when you watch the numbers of these emotions, you see sadness stays about the same. You see anger start to go up, and it kind of peaks, and then it comes down fairly quickly if they continue to work through the trauma. And that's a sign of progress, right? They're able to feel anger that this terrible thing that happened to them. But then the other thing that happens is the anger comes back down, the sadness remains, because that is a justified, appropriate emotion for having been through a traumatic event. But the big thing that happens is that shame comes down. And shame is one of the things that kind of just rules people when they've had traumatic experiences. They just carry this like heavy weight of shame on their shoulders. And so when you start to see that shame drop in those numbers, and it's like, the person starts to come alive again, it's magical.